Champagne is still cold when she says it. Across a Beverly Hills showroom that costs more per square foot than most people earn. In a year, a manager in Creepsauce leans toward a woman in a navy blazer and lowers her voice, not to whisper, but to make sure the words carry. You don't look like someone who belongs here. Now, the woman in the blazer does not move, not a flinch, not a breath out of rhythm. Across the room, a security guard's hand drifts from his radio and stops halfway. A young saleswoman with a phone at her hip turns it over, quietly, screen down, finding the record button by feel. An older woman in a navy cardigan sets her handbag on the cushion beside her. Nobody knows yet. Nobody in that room knows whose name is on the deed to the building they are standing in. Nobody knows whose hands drew the light angle above the $2 million case behind them, and the manager reaching for her phone, about to make the second worst call of her career. She has no idea. None of them do. Not yet. The alarm never went off, because Renee Caldwell was already awake. 5 in the morning. The bedroom still dark. That specific quiet that only exists before the rest of the world remembers it has somewhere to be. On the edge of the bed, and reached for the one thing she always put on first, not her watch. Her phone, not the pearl earrings she kept in the dish by the lamp, the bracelet silver, tarnished at the clasp. Kind of piece that would never make it past the front display in any of her 47 stores. Too worn, too simple, too far from the word luxury in any of its commercial definitions. Her mother had worn it every single day for 31 years. Renee had worn it every single day for the 23 years since. She held it between two fingers for a moment, just held it, the way you hold something that cannot be replaced, and you know it. And the knowing, after all this time, doesn't get easier. It just gets quieter. She clasped it on her left wrist and stood up. Kitchen was cold. She made coffee the same way she had made it since her 20s. Too strong, not enough sugar, and stood at the window looking out at the driveway where the Honda Civic sat under the yellow glow of the porch light. 2003, the year she bought it. The year the company finally started making real money. The year she could have bought almost anything she wanted and chose, deliberately and without apology, to buy a sensible sedan that got 32 miles to the gallon. People asked about it constantly. Board members, the Forbes photographer who spent 20 minutes trying to angle his shot so the car wouldn't appear in the frame. Why don't you upgrade? She always gave the same answer, because every time I look at it, I remember where I came from. What she never added, the part she kept for herself, was the rest of it. She remembered where she came from, because she needed to. Because the moment you forget what it felt like to have nothing is the moment you understanding the people who still do. Understanding people, actually understanding them, not performing it, not printing it in a mission statement, that was the whole point. Always been the whole point. She rinsed her mug, set it in the rack. Today she decided would be Beverly Hills. She hadn't called ahead. She never called ahead. The surprise visits weren't assault surveillance. They weren't about catching anyone doing something wrong. They were about seeing her stores the way her customers saw them, unfiltered, unrehearsed, real. She picked up her keys, touched the bracelet once, and walked out into the dark. She was 19 years old, Atlanta, summer, the kind of heat that sits on your shoulders before 9 in the morning and doesn't apologize. She had walked into a jewelry store on Peachtree Street wearing her best blouse. Pressed. She had ironed it herself twice that morning because the collar kept going crooked, and she refused, absolutely refused, to show up looking like she hadn't tried. She walked up to the counter and said she was there about the position, the one advertised in the window. The manager looked up from whatever he was doing. He looked at her, not at her hands, which were steadier than she felt, at anything she said or how she said it, just at her, that particular kind of looking that takes less than 3 seconds and communicates everything the person will never say out loud. He said, "We're not hiring right now." And Renee said, "Oh, because else do you say when someone has already decided the conversation is over before it began?" She turned to leave, and there it was, right there, taped to the inside of the glass door she was walking back through. "Help wanted, inquire within." She stood with her hand on the door and read those 2 words 3 times to make sure she was reading them correctly. She was. She pushed through the door and walked out into the Atlantica heat and stood on the sidewalk and felt something happen inside her chest. Grief, not rage, not quite either one. Clarity, the kind that only arrives when someone shows you, plainly, without ambiguity, exactly how the world works. She stood there for maybe 45 seconds. Then she started walking, and somewhere between that door and the end of the block, Ray Caldwell made herself a promise. Not out loud, not in the dramatic way promises get made in stories told afterward. Just a quiet, private, absolute decision. She was going to build her own room, and when it was built, no one who walked through the door would ever be made to feel the way she felt standing on that sidewalk. Once, not ever. The Beverly Hills flagship. That was what everyone called it. The flagship. As if the whole company were a fleet and this were the one leading the way. Which, in a sense, it was. Renee had designed every inch of it herself. Not with a decorator, not with a firm that charged $400 an hour to tell you what your brand was supposed to feel like. She had drawn it by hand on paper bought from a drugstore, had sat on the floor of the empty space 3 weeks before opening with a cup of bad coffee, and figured out exactly where every light fixture needed to go, so that the stones in the cases would catch the light at the right angle. The angle mattered. Most people didn't know that. Most people walked into a jewelry store and thought the diamonds sparkled on their own. Understand that sparkling was engineered, that someone had stood in a specific spot, looked at a specific case, and made a decision about the exact degree of tilt that would make a stone come alive instead of just sitting there being expensive. Renee understood it because she had been the one standing there. She pulled the Civic to the curb on Rodeo Drive and sat for a moment without getting out. Storefront. The window displays, the brushed steel of the signage, luminous designs, her word, her choice. She had spent 2 weeks on that name. Up 17 options on a whiteboard in her apartment and eliminated them one by one until only one remained. She remembered the morning she crossed out last competitor, stepped back, looked at what was left. Luminous. Yes, that was it. Was exactly it. She got out of the car. The morning air on Rodeo Drive had that quality it only had before 10. Cool, unhurried, before the street remembered it was supposed to perform. She straightened her navy blazer, touched the bracelet once the way she always did before walking into one of her stores unannounced. Then she walked through the front door of the store she had built from nothing. The first thing she noticed was the music. Sopped, without being soporific, exactly the balance she had specified. The second thing she noticed was the lighting on the Aurora case. She stopped just for a fraction of a second, just long enough to see it. The Aurora display, the centerpiece. $2 million collection that represented the absolute peak of everything Luminous Designs had ever produced. The light was wrong, not dark. The case was illuminated. Something had shifted. The fixture had been adjusted, or the case itself had been moved because the angle was off. Maybe 15 degrees, maybe a little more, enough that the light was hitting the stones flat instead of catching their facets. Enough that the collection she had poured 18 months into creating looked right now like very expensive jewelry in a very nice case. Instead of what it actually was, she said nothing, noted it, filed it, kept walking. She wanted to see the whole store before she let herself be seen. Near the side counter, a young man worked through a stack of inventory paperwork with his left hand, while cross-referencing something on his computer with the other. The practiced split focus of someone who had learned to do 2 things at once, because one job's pay required a second job's hours. 2 ninties, efficient without being hurried. His name tag read Damien. Near the Aurora display, a young woman was stroking a tray of pendants with the careful attention of someone who actually looked at what she was touching. Tag Sora, early 20s, the kind of focus that didn't come from training. By the entrance, a man in a security uniform stood at the edge of the room. 40s, built like someone who had spent years learning how to be still without being absent, watching the room the way people watch rooms when they have been trained to see what other people miss. She'd seen his file, knew his numbers, not performance metrics, the kind that told you who someone actually was. Former Marine, 14 months at this location, reliable according to every report she'd received. Quiet, she moved toward the centerpiece of the store. A woman appeared at her elbow, smooth approach, the smile already in place before Renee had fully turned. Hi there. Welcome to Luminous Designs. Is there something special I can help you find today? The voice was calibrated. That was the word Renee always used for this particular customer service register. Warm enough to seem welcoming, controlled enough to be assessing. Sylvia Hargrove, store manager, 8 months in the role. Renee knew her face from the personnel file, knew the store's numbers under her management, above projection for the previous 2 quarters. Numbers those only told you so much. I'd like to see the Aurora collection, Renee said, and she watched. She watched Sylvia's face perform a small, fast, precise adjustment. Smile stayed, but something behind it rearranged itself. The eyes did a thing, a quick thing that Renee recognized immediately. because she was looking for it, because she had been on the receiving end of it her entire adult life. The assessment, not of Renee as a customer, of Renee as a category, as a type, as a conclusion reached in 3 seconds based on information that had nothing to do with what she had said or how she'd said it. Of course, Sylvia said. I should let you know. Those pieces start at $200,000. Renee looked at her steadily. I understand. Just so you're aware of the price point, I am. A beat that lasted 1 second too long. Right this way, the Aurora case was magnificent, even with the light at the wrong angle, even like this. Renee leaned in to look at the centerpiece, the necklace. $350,000 of Colombian diamonds set in platinum worked so precisely, so it looks like someone had frozen at the exact moment it would have been most beautiful. Had designed it herself, had sat at a drafting table for 6 weeks working on the setting alone because the stone was perfect and what the stone needed was to be held in a way that got out of its own way. On this diamond is exceptional, Renee said. Colombian origin. Silence from Sylvia. Then how did you yes? Right. Straightened and looked at her directly. The clarity is flawless, but the prongs on the secondary stones are slightly uneven. Need to know what you're looking at. Sylvia's face did something complicated. Our pieces are crafted by master jewelers. I'm sure they are. A pause. I'm particular about quality. The door chimed. Sylvia's entire body changed. Not subtly, the kind of shift visible to anyone who was already watching. An older couple walked in, 60s, well-dressed, the comfortable ease of people who had been wealthy long enough they'd stopped thinking about it. She didn't know them, but Renee recognized the posture, old money, the particular relaxation of people who had never been assessed at a door before arriving at it. Excuse me, said to Renee. Not looking at Renee, already turning away. I need to help these customers. No, one moment. No, I'll be right back. No acknowledgement that Renee had been mid-sentence, mid-examination, mid-standing next to an unlocked display case that was now being left open because Sylvia's had simply walked away from it. Gone, Renee stood next to the Aurora case. She didn't move. Across the room in one of the upholstered chairs near the secondary display cases, an older woman sat with a small handbag in her lap. 71 years old. Silver hair cut close, the no-nonsense kind. The choice of someone who stopped making decisions based on fashion long before it became fashionable to do so. A navy cardigan. Dark eyes that were not at this particular moment looking at anything in the store. They were looking at Renee. Her name was Elzina Voss. She had been a customer at Luminous Designs for 4 years. She had bought her daughter's engagement ring here. Both of her granddaughter's pearl sets for their 16th birthdays. She had come in today for a bracelet, rose gold, simple, ordered 3 weeks ago. She was waiting for it to be brought from the back. She watched the woman in the navy blazer standing alone beside the open Aurora case. She watched the store manager across the room, now laughing at something the man in the cashmere coat had said, a champagne flute being extended on a small silver tray. She watched, and she understood exactly what she was seeing. 15 minutes passed. Renee stood next to that case for 15 minutes and did not take out her phone, did not sit down, did not flag anyone, did not raise her voice. She stood the way she had learned to stand, upright, composed, with the patience of someone who had spent 23 years being underestimated and had discovered that patience, wielded correctly, was not endurance, was strategy. Sora, the young woman with the careful hands, caught Renee's eye from across the room and moved toward her with the instinct of someone who understood it without being told what customer service actually meant. Can I help you with anything, ma'am? Before Renee could answer, Sora, Sylvia's voice, sharp and measured simultaneously. The edge of an instruction that wasn't phrased as one. I need you to organize the back inventory. Sora looked at Renee. A quick look, apologetic, frustrated, the look of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had no leverage to change it and was sorry about that, even though none of it was her fault. She walked toward the back room, put her hand on the door handle, and stopped. She didn't go through. She stood there with her hand on the handle, her back to the room, and made the decision that took about 3 seconds and cost considerably more than that. She turned around, quietly, without announcing it, walked back along the side wall until she was standing in the shadow between 2 display units, where she had clear sightline to the Aurora case and to Sylvia, and to the woman who was still standing alone beside it. She took out her phone, pressed record, because some things you make sure there is a record of, and this was one of them. Sylvia came back eventually, with the stride of someone who had decided the intermission was over on her schedule. Sorry about that. Where were we? Renee looked at her. I'd still like to see the Aurora collection. I'm interested in the necklace. Just behind Sylvia's eyes again, faster this time, smaller, the recalibration of someone who had expected the customer to be gone by now. Piece is $350,000. I know what it's priced at. Of course. A pause a half second too long. For a purchase of this magnitude, we have standard procedures. We'd need to see proof of funds, something that confirms the purchase is viable. Renee didn't respond immediately. She turned her head slowly and looked across the room. The couple, the Harringtons, she would learn later, were handling a bracelet retailing at $280,000. No credit verification, no bank statement, no proof of anything except that Sylvia had already decided what kind of customers they were. Tay turned back. Did you ask them for proof of funds? Silence. That's a different situation. How? One word. Placed on the floor between them and left there. Sylvia's professional composure held for one moment longer. Then something underneath it surfaced. Not cruelty exactly, not performance exactly. Something more unguarded than either. The kind of certainty that belongs to people who have never had to examine the rules they were handed because the rules have always worked in their favor. Her voice dropped, direct, the courtesy stripped back to what was underneath it. I'm going to be straightforward with you. Less designed for everyone. Renee was very still. You don't look like someone who belongs here. The words moved through the room, not loudly. Sylvia hadn't raised her voice. She had said it the way people say things they believe completely, without performance, without cruelty, without even the awareness that they are saying something that should not be said. The way a person states a fact about weather, but words don't require volume to travel. Near the side counter, Damian Cruz looked up from his paperwork. And along the side wall, in the shadow between two display units, Sora Nakamura held her phone steady. Call security, Sylvia said. To Roy Tanner, who was standing 8 feet away and had been there for the last 4 minutes. Roy was 45. He had a daughter in her final year of college and a one-bedroom apartment in Inglewood and a job he needed. He knew all of those things. He also knew what he was looking at. 20 years in the Marines had given him many things, but the most useful, the one he used every day, was this. He could read a room. The room was telling him something very specific right now. He looked at Renee. He looked at Sylvia. He did not move. Ma'am. His voice was quiet, even. I don't think that's something I'm going to do. The temperature in the room changed. Roy didn't move, which was, if you thought about it, an extraordinary thing. A man standing in the middle of his workplace being given a direct order by the person signed his schedule with a daughter in her final year of college and rent due in 11 days, and he didn't move. Sylvia stared at him. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds, which sounds brief, but 5 seconds of silence in a room full of people who are all pretending not to watch is a very long time. Roy, her voice had lost its professional smoothness. What was underneath it was harder. I'm giving you a direct instruction. I understand that. Then you understand what happens if you don't follow it. Roy held her gaze. Not aggressively, not performing bravado. Just steadily, the way a person holds their ground when they have already decided where the ground is. I do, he said. 2 words. And in those 2 understand the cost. I've calculated it. And I'm still standing here. Sylvia turned, looked at Damian Cruz, who had been standing near the register with his clipboard lowering slowly toward his side, the way a person's hands lower when they realize they've forgotten they're holding something. Damian. The word came out clipped. Call the police. Damian opened his mouth, closed it. The expression of someone who has been placed without warning at a fork in a road they didn't know they were walking on. At Renee. At Sylvia. Then at Renee again. Sylvia. His voice came out carefully. I really think we should take a moment before. Now. The word hit the air like something thrown. Damian Fair set his clipboard down on the counter. The deliberate slowness of someone buying time to think while their hands do something automatic. He looked at the clipboard, looked at his phone, looked at the woman standing by the Aurora case who had not moved and had not raised her voice and had not done a single thing that justified what was happening to her. Pick up his phone. Sylvia. His voice was different this time, still careful, but with something underneath it that had not been there 30 seconds ago. Asking you to... Sylvia turned to look at him fully. Excuse me, I'm asking you. He held her gaze. Before this goes any further, please stop the please. That was the word that landed. Not authority, he didn't have it. Not an ultimatum, just a person asking another person to pull back from the edge before what was already bad became something that couldn't be undone. Sylvia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at Roy, then at Renee, and then she did something that nobody in the room expected. She turned away from all of them, walked to the side of the room, stood with her back partly to the floor, pulled out her own phone, and began to dial. Along the side wall, in the gap between two display units where she had been standing since she turned back from the stockroom door, Sora Nakamura kept her phone level and her hand steady. She had been there since before Sylvia had given the call security order. She had a clear angle on the Aurora case, on Sylvia's face, and on everything that had been said in the last several minutes. She had all of it. Eleanor Voss had been sitting in that chair for 22 minutes. She had come in for a bracelet. Rose gold, simple. She had ordered it 3 weeks ago, and they had called yesterday to say it was ready. She had driven herself here, still drove herself everywhere, despite her daughter's increasingly pointed suggestions about rideshares. Parked 2 blocks away because the lot on Rodeo charged $11 before 10, and she had not spent 31 years teaching middle school to pay $11 to park for 20 minutes. She had sat down in the upholstered chair and waited, and then she had watched. She had watched from the moment the woman in the navy blazer walked in. Watched the manager approach with that smile, the one that looked like warmth but wasn't. Had watched the couple arrive and the manager leave. Had watched the 15 minutes of stealthing and being invisible. Had watched the conversation she couldn't fully hear but didn't need to hear fully because she had been a woman walking into rooms for 71 years and she knew exactly what was happening. Thought, it's not my business. She had thought, I don't know the full story. She had thought, stay out of it. These were the thoughts of a woman who had spent 3 decades learning that speaking up had a price, and the price was usually paid by the person who spoke. She had learned that lesson in a school in Georgia where she was the only black teacher in her department for 22 of her 31 years. She had learned it in staff meetings and parent conferences, and in the particular quality of silence that happened when she walked into a room and the conversation shifted direction without anyone acknowledging that it had. She had learned to calculate, to weigh, to measure what speaking would cost against what silence would preserve, but then she had heard it. 4 words, said in the low, direct tone of something believed completely. You don't look like someone who belongs here. And something in Eleanor Voss's calculation changed. She set her handbag on the cushion beside her. She placed both hands on the arms of the chair. She stood up, slowly, carefully, the deliberate movement of a woman who wanted to be certain she was steady before she committed to the direction she was going. Because she had decided. She walked across the floor, not rushing, not performing urgency, just walking with the unhurried certainty of someone who has made up their mind and is no longer interested in changing it. She's 2 feet from Sylvia, who was standing with her phone half-raised, mid-dial, and had not registered Eleanor's approach because she had not been watching that part of the room. Sylvia turned. Eleanor looked at her directly, without raising her voice, without any of the performance of confrontation. Just one person looking at another person and saying what was true. I have been coming to this store for 4 years, she said. Bought my daughter's engagement ring here. I have sent every person I know who needed jewelry to this store. I believed in what this store stood for. Sylvia's phone lowered slightly. I have never. Eleanor paused. 1 beat in 4 years. Been more ashamed to be standing in this store than I am right now. The room was completely quiet. Classical music was still playing. It was still playing, which struck several people afterward as almost absurd. This gentle, civilized backdrop. Nobody in the room could hear it. Sylvia's mouth was slightly open. Eleanor turned away from her, turned to Renee, and her voice, when she spoke, was different. Saw softer, warmer. Are you all right? Renee looked at her. This woman she had never met, 71 years old in a navy cardigan who had been sitting in a chair waiting for a bracelet and had stood up anyway. Renee said quietly, "Thank you." Eleanor nodded once, the nod of someone who accepts that and moves on. Who doesn't need more than that. She walked back to her chair, sat down, placed her hands in her lap. Looked at the wall. Sylvia found her voice, because she always found her voice. That had been true her entire life. She had grown up in a house in Greenwich, Connecticut, where composure was not a skill, it was an inheritance. Where the correct response to any challenge was not to examine yourself but to hold your ground. Where certainty was the armor you wore, so automatically you forgot it was armor. This is a private matter, she said, to Eleanor. Clipped, dismissive, the tone of someone reminding a stranger of their place. Eleanor looked at her with the expression of someone who has been teaching teenagers for 31 years and is no longer capable of being intimidated by poor behavior from adults. Perhaps, she said, you should have conducted it privately. She turned back to the wall. Sylvia turned back to Renee. and what had been underneath the professional surface all morning was now fully visible. Not cruelty, precisely, but something that had stopped trying to look like anything other than what it was. "I've been more than patient," Sylvia said. "I've given you multiple opportunities to leave gracefully if you don't. I'm not leaving." Renee's voice was even, clean, the tone of someone who has already decided something and is simply reporting it. "This is private property, and I have the right to. I know what your rights are." Renee looked at her steadily. "I also know what mine are." Sylvia made a decision in that moment. You could see it happening. The decision to stop managing the situation and simply end it. She turned to Roy. "You're fired if you don't remove her right now." Roy looked at her. "Noted," he said, and didn't move. She turned to Damien. "You too." Damien picked up his clipboard from the counter, held it. It back down. He was 26 years old, taking a business degree at night, working this job during the day because he needed the income and believed genuinely that this was a company worth working for. Had read the mission statement on his first day, had thought briefly that it was the kind of thing companies printed and forgot. He was thinking about it again now. "Sylvia," he said, "I can't do what you're asking me to do. Then you don't work here anymore." Threat landed. Damien absorbed it. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed something into the search bar that had been at the back of his mind since the moment he heard Ginda give her name to whoever she'd called. Renee Caldwell. Jewelry, the result at Forbes, the photograph, navy blazer, silver bracelet on the left wrist, the specific angle of a jaw he was looking at right now across a room that felt suddenly smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. Looked at his phone, looked at the woman standing by the Aurora case, looked at his phone again. His hands did not shake. But his face did something it couldn't help doing, the involuntary expression of understanding arriving badly. All at once, through a door you didn't know was there. He said nothing. He looked at Sora across the room, who was looking back at him with her phone held carefully at her side. He gave her the smallest possible nod, the nod of two people who have just realized simultaneously that they are standing in the middle of something significant. Sora's grip on her phone steadied. She kept recording. Renee had been watching all of it. She had been watching Sylvia's escalation and Roy's stillness and Damien's face when the search results loaded, and Eleanor's return to her chair with the particular composure of someone who has said what needed saying and is content to let it stand. Been watching because watching was what she did. It was how she had built 47 stores across Seagull States. Not by announcing herself, not by performing authority, by watching and understanding and knowing with the quiet certainty of someone who has been in a room long enough to see all of it, exactly what was happening and why. And now she had seen enough. She reached into her bag, took out her phone. Sylvia stiffened. "Don't you dare!" "I'm not recording," Renee said. Looking up, "I'm making a call." She found the contact, pressed dial. It rang twice. Sarah. Her voice when she spoke was professional. Cold, the voice of someone who has shifted registers, from the patience she'd been exercising for the past 40 minutes to the register she used when something needed to be done. "Renee, I'm at the Beverly Hills location. We have a situation that requires an emergency board call." "Yes, all of them." Pause. "I'll hold." She lowered the phone slightly, looked at Sylvia, who had heard two words that was now doing something to her expression. "Beverly Hills location. At a store, not the store. Location. The way someone says it when they are distinguishing it from other locations in a chain. When the phrase carries, embedded in its grammar, the specific authority of ownership. Something in Sylvia's mind was reaching, pulling at a thread. The name, Renee, had been circling for the last several minutes like a word on the tip of a tongue that won't quite surface. She had heard it somewhere, had read it somewhere, on memos, on policy documents, on the footer of every internal communication she had received in the 8 months since accepting this position. Paychecks. On the staff handbook she'd been given on her first day. Renee Caldwell, founder and chief executive officer. Luminous Designs. Sylvia's hand, which had been moving toward the counter, stopped moving. Her face, over the space of 3 seconds, went from certainty to something that had no clean name. Confusion, exactly. The expression of a person whose architecture has just been revealed to be built on a foundation that doesn't exist. Damien saw it happen from across the room. He watched it happen and felt something he would later describe as a building realize it's been constructed wrong. Dramatic, not sudden, just the slow, terrible settling of something that cannot be unsettled. Renee lifted the phone again. "Yeah, I'm here." Her eyes stayed on Sylvia. "I need a formal record of this conversation. Please note the time, the location, and that I am requesting an emergency review of management conduct at the Beverly Hills flagship. I'll send a full report within the hour." She listened. "Yes, thank you." She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her bag. And then she opened her bag one more time, took out a business card. She set it on the surface of the Aurora display case. Thrown, not placed with drama, just set down with the same deliberate care she had used when designing the case, when specifying the lining color, when choosing the exact weight of the velvet, because the weight of the velvet mattered in a way that was almost impossible to explain to someone who hadn't spent 18 months thinking about nothing but this collection. Card sat on the glass, clean, simple typeface, no decoration except the small logo in the corner that appeared on every piece of luminous design stationery, every store window, every receipt. Staff handbook Sylvia Hargrove had been handed on her first day of work. Renee Caldwell, founder and chief executive officer. Luminous design. Sylvia stared at it. The room was silent, completely silent, except for the classical music that was somehow still playing. Damian Cruz crossed the room, slowly, the careful movement of someone navigating a space that has been identified as fragile. Beside Sylvia, looked at the card, looked at Renee, looked at Sylvia again. "Sylvia," his voice was very quiet. "I need you to hear me." She was still looking at "Look at me," he said. Up. He held out his phone, screen facing her, the Forbes profile, the photograph, navy blazer, silver bracelet, the headline in clean, bold type, "America's richest self-made women, 8 consecutive years." Sylvia looked at the screen, then at the woman sitting 6 feet away, then at the screen again. Her mouth moved. Nothing came out, because there are moments when the thing you are looking at is so far outside what you had understood the situation to be that language simply fails. There's no mechanism for this, no word for the sensation of realizing that every decision you made in the last 45 minutes was built on an assumption that was not just wrong, but catastrophically, irreversibly, documentably wrong. In front of witnesses, on camera, Sylvia sat down, not elegantly, not with the composed deliberateness she had practiced her entire professional life. Her leg simply made a decision without consulting her, and she sat in the nearest chair, the same chair she had offered Harrington's earlier, with the champagne, with the full warmth of her customer service performance, and she put her hands in her lap and looked at them. She said, one syllable, one vowel sound, the specific sound of a world reorganizing itself around a new and terrible fact. Roy heard it. Sora heard it. Her phone hand was steady. Damian heard it and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way people look at ceilings when they are trying to organize thoughts that have temporarily scattered. Eleanor Voss heard it. She turned her head slightly from the wall she had been looking at, just slightly, not far enough to be obvious. Far enough to see, and Renee heard it. She had heard that before, not often, but enough to recognize it. Pitch, the sound of someone arriving too late at a truth they could not have been argued into. Could not have been told into, had to find themselves through the door of their own actions, after the door had closed behind them. She looked at Sylvia for a long moment. The Harringtons had drifted toward the door during the escalation. They had not left. Roy had noted it. He noted exits automatically, the habit of 20 years, and they had stopped in the doorway. Not outside, in the threshold, listening. Mr. Harrington turned first, then his wife. They stepped back into the store, slowly. Drama. 2 people who had been comfortable for a long time and were now uncomfortable in a very specific way. The discomfort of understanding that comfort they had been offered was built on a contrast they had not asked for and did not want. Mr. Harrington looked at Renee, then at the card on the case. "We owe you an apology," he said, not performing guilt. Saying the thing that was true. "We watched what was happening and we should have said something before now." "Customers here for 6 years, Mrs. Harrington said. She set the small jewelry box she had been holding on the nearest counter. "We came here because of what this store was supposed to be." She looked at Sylvia, not with anger. "With disappointment, which lands differently. We'll come back when it is again." And they left. The box sat on the counter. Nobody moved to put it back. Sylvia stared at it. The piece she had spent 40 minutes helping them select, with the champagne and the chairs and the full warmth of everything she had to offer. Sitting on the counter because the people she had treated, the store's ideal customers, had walked out. Because of what she had done in the name of serving them. After a long moment, Sylvia placed both hands on the arms of the chair and stood, slowly, the movement of someone whose body has not yet caught up with what her mind has just processed. She looked once more at the business card on the glass. Then she walked toward the back of the store, past the secondary cases, past the door to the stockroom, to the small desk she had used every morning for 8 months. Teet opened the top drawer and began. Renee pulled the chair from behind the nearest counter. She placed it across from where Sylvia had been sitting moments before, in the space between the display cases where there was enough room for 2 people to be at eye level with each other without an obstacle between them. And she sat down, not standing over, not above. A way she always positioned herself when she had something true to say to someone and she wanted them to be able to hear it. She breathed once, and she began. "I'm going to say some things," she said, "and I need you to let me finish." Sylvia looked up from the drawer, nodded, small, careful, the nod of someone who has run out of other options. "Firing you because I hate you." Renee's voice was even, unhurried. "I'm not firing you to punish you. I'm not firing you because I want anyone in this room to feel like they've won something." Sylvia's jaw was tight. Holding. "I'm firing you because I built this place so that no one would ever have to feel invisible inside it. Today, in this store, the store that exists because I sat on its empty floor 23 years ago and drew it by hand on paper I bought from a drugstore. Me feels invisible." One tear moved down Sylvia's face. She didn't wipe it. "In my own house," Renee said. "You made me feel like I didn't belong in my own house." The room was still. The classical music had stopped. No one had turned it off. It had simply ended, one track concluding, and in the space before the next one began, the silence was absolute. Sylvia opened her mouth. "I didn't know. I know you didn't. If I had known who you were, that's exactly what I need you to hear." Renee's voice didn't change. Still even. Still unhurried. "That's not a defense, Sylvia. That's the whole problem. The fact that knowing who I am would have changed how you treated me. That's the problem. Not the solution." Sylvia closed her mouth. "The woman you decided not to serve this morning, if she had just been a customer. If she had saved for 2 years to buy herself something beautiful. If she had walked in here with nothing to prove and every right to be here. You would have sent her away, and she would have left, and she could have carried that home with her. And you would have gone back to your office and not thought about it twice." A pause. "That's what I can't have in this company." "Can change." Renee looked at her. "I know I can if you give me the chance to." Sylvia. Gently. The word placed gently. Being willing to change when the stakes are this high is not the same as having changed. Those are 2 different things, and I've been in this business long enough to know the difference. Silence. "I'm not saying you can't change," Renee continued. "That change, the kind that reaches the place where these decisions actually get made, takes more than a conversation. It takes more than wanting to keep your job." She paused. "It takes looking at the rules you were given and deciding deliberately to question them. Not because someone caught you following them, because you finally looked at them directly and understood what they were costing other people." Sylvia's hands were still. She was looking at them the way people look at things they are not seeing. "You tell me that's where you are right now." A long pause, the longest of the morning, and Sylvia, who had an answer for everything, who had grown up in a house where composure was inherited and certainty was air, said nothing. Which was its own kind of answer. Renee nodded. "Clear out your desk," she said. "HR will be in touch about the formal process. Your references will reflect that you managed this location and that the store performed above projection. I won't go beyond what's accurate." Sylvia looked up. "That's more than." "It's what's accurate," Renee said simply. "The numbers were real. That part of the job you did." She stood up and turned to the rest of the room. Damian Cruz was standing near the counter, hands at his sides. The stillness of someone who has been through something significant and is still inside it. "Damian," he looked at her. "You tried to stop this, twice, before it escalated and again when it already had. You didn't have the authority to stop it. Try anyway." He swallowed. "Effective today. You're the manager of this location." The words landed and he stood in them for a moment, absorbing the distance between where he had been 45 minutes ago and where he was now. "Won't let you down," he said. "No excess, no performance, just the right words." "I know," Renee said. She turned to Sora, who had stepped out from the shadow between the display units and was standing in the open now, phone at her side, eyes steady. "Sora, yes, you didn't leave when you were told to." "No, why?" "Because leaving felt like agreeing," she said. "Didn't agree." "You're the assistant manager," Renee said. "We'll talk about your responsibilities tomorrow." Sora nodded. Held it together. "Just." Renee turned to Roy, still in his position by the wall, still with that quality of presence, not rigid, not performing, just there in the way that some people are there when they have decided where they stand and are finished deciding. She crossed the room to him. Roy, ma'am, you were given a direct order. You refused it. You were threatened termination. And you still didn't move. Roy was quiet for a moment. I've followed wrong orders before, he said, early in my career. Carried those every day since. He paused. My daughter graduates in 60 days. I need this job. Another pause. But some things you don't do regardless of what it costs. You'll receive a formal commendation. And a raise, effective immediately. Roy nodded once. Renee paused. What you did this morning, staying where you were. I was standing there. Roy said, my daughter asked me once what I was most proud of in 20 years. Looked at Renee. I didn't have a good answer then. He left the rest of it where it was. Renee nodded and turned away before either of them had to figure out what came after that. Sylvia was at the back of the store, moving slowly through the contents of her desk with the mechanical, careful movements of someone running on the very last of something. Small things, the kind of objects that accumulate over 8 months without you noticing until the moment you're putting them in a box. Renee watched her for a moment from across the room and felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not satisfaction, not the clean relief that stories about justice were supposed to deliver. Something heavier and more honest, the feeling of having done the right thing and understanding clearly that right things carry weight. They are not free. She turned away and found Eleanor Voss standing at her elbow. The first customer Damien approached was a woman standing near the engagement ring display. Mid-50s. She had been for the better part of 30 minutes, had arrived before the morning became what it became, had been browsing quietly, and had then stood still while everything unfolded around her with the careful invisibility of someone who understood she was witnessing something private, even though it was happening in a public room. She was still there. Damien stopped beside her. I'm so sorry for the disruption, he said, and meant it. Not the rehearsed apology of customer service extraditing, but the actual apology of a person who understood what had happened and felt the weight of it on behalf of the place he now represented. Can I start from the beginning with you? The woman looked at him, then at the display case, then back at him with the expression of someone remembering why they had come. My son is proposing next month, she said. Congratulations. He said it simply, without the performance of enthusiasm. Tell me about her. And she did. Across the store, Sora was at the counter with Eleanor Voss's bracelet, unwrapping it from its tissue with the care of someone who understood that the object in her hands represented something more than its material components. Rose gold, simple, the kind of piece that didn't announce itself. It's beautiful, Sora said. Eleanor looked at it. My granddaughter turns 16 next month. Been asking for something she can wear every day. She paused. Not something that sits in a box. Sora looked at the bracelet, then at Eleanor's wrist, then at the bracelet again. She'll wear this every day, she said. Eleanor looked at her. How do you know? Because it's the kind of thing that goes with everything. Sora set it in its box, then stopped. And because her grandmother chose it, which means she'll know it matters. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're going to be good at this. Sora looked up. The job, Eleanor said, and smiled, small, genuine, the smile of someone who has been watching carefully all morning and has arrived at a conclusion she is confident in. You're going to be good at it. Sora set the bracelet in its box and said nothing, but her hands were steady. Roy moved through the room the way he always is, present, without being obtrusive, watching, without performing watchfulness. The morning had cost him something. Not the job as it turned out, but the version of the morning he had imagined when he woke up. The ordinary Tuesday, the uneventful shift, the drive home without having had to make a decision that felt like the hardest one of the year. The version was gone. What was here instead was different, harder in some ways, but not worse. He thought about his daughter. What he would tell her if he told her anything, about what he would leave out, about whether she would understand at 22 that some decisions look small from the seats outside, a man not moving from a position by a wall, and are not small. Thought she probably would. She was her father's daughter after all. Renee stood near the back of the store, watching, not supervising. She was not a person who supervised. She was a person who watched and understood and acted when action was required, and knew the difference between those moments and the moments that required simply being present. It was a being present sentiment. She watched Damien lean toward the woman by the engagement rings, his posture open and attentive. Watched Sora close Eleanor's jewelry box with both hands. Watched Roy settle back into the room with the ease of someone who had found his footing again after a morning that had tried to take it from him. the store was working. Not the way it had been working before, not the version that had existed under 8 months of Sylvia's management, with its invisible hierarchies and its calibrated welcomes and its champagne offered to some and withheld from others. Something different, something that felt to Renee like the thing she had been trying to build all along. A room where people could feel the difference. She opened her notebook, the actual paper one, the kind she had been using since before she could afford anything better. Had never stopped using because the physical act of writing was how she thought. 3 names: Damian Cruz, Soren Nakamura, Roy Tanner. She looked at them for a moment, then she wrote one more. Eleanor Voss, and below that, not a business note, not an action item, nothing that would end up in a quarterly review. She wrote 2 words. This is why. She looked at those 2 words for a long time, because sometimes in the middle of the numbers and the logistics and the 47 stores and the board calls and the Forbes rankings and all the apparatus of a thing that had grown very large from something that had started very small, sometimes you needed to see it written down. Simple, clear, no explanation required. This is why. She closed the notebook. She walked to the Aurora display. The case was still lit at the wrong angle. The adjustment she had noted when she walked in, the 15-degree error that had been making the collection look like very expensive jewelry instead of what it actually was. She had been going to address it that morning. She had noted it and filed it, and then other things had happened and the case had stayed as it was. She looked at it now, the necklace, $350,000, Colombian diamond in platinum setting. The prongs worked so precisely they were nearly invisible, the stone sitting in them like water in a palm. Designed it at a drafting table over 6 weeks, starting over 3 times, because the stone was perfect, and what a perfect stone required was a setting that stepped aside. She found the adjustment mechanism built into the base of the case, small, flush with the frame, invisibles unless you knew it was there. She had designed it herself and had never put it in any documentation because it was the kind of thing that should only need to be adjusted by someone who understood what they were adjusting toward. To treat 3 degrees, 4, stopped when she felt the resistance change. The light shifted and the necklace came alive. Like that. The way it was supposed to. The facets waking up, the light refracting through the stone in the specific pattern she had spent 18 months engineering. Not sparkling, exactly, but something more precise than sparkling. The way water moves when it is very clear and very deep. Extraordinary. That was still the word. She had thought it the first time she saw the finished piece, sitting under the correct light in her office, and she thought it now. The word had not diminished. The thing it was describing had not diminished. Both of them were exactly what they had been. Back from the case, stood looking at it for a moment. Then she turned around and found Eleanor Voss standing a few feet away, bracelet box in a small bag in her hand, coat on, ready to go. They stood near the corrected Aurora case, both of them looking at the necklace for a moment, the light doing what it was supposed to do. Extraordinary, Eleanor said. Yes, you designed it 18 months. Eleanor looked at it for another moment. You can tell, she said. Not everyone can tell, but you can tell when something was made by someone who was trying to get it exactly right rather than trying to get it finished. Paused. This was made by someone trying to get it exactly right. Renee looked at her. I wanted to say goodbye, Eleanor said. And to say I hope you know that what happened this morning wasn't nothing. For me. I know, Renee said. What you did wasn't nothing either. Eleanor made a small sound, dismissive almost. The sound of someone who doesn't think they did very much. Stood up, Renee said, for someone you didn't know, when it would have been much easier to sit. I sat for 13 years, Eleanor says. You'd think at my age I'd have run out of the sitting down kind of courage. She looked at Renee. I haven't always been brave. I want you to know that. This morning was not representative of a lifetime of speaking up. I know. I stayed quiet for a long time about a lot of things, and I have carried that. She paused, but what you said about the woman who might have just been a customer, who safed up and came in and got sent away and went home and nobody ever knew. Kept thinking about that while I was sitting there. She looked at Renee steadily. I thought about how many rooms I walked into in 31 years. How many times someone looked at me the way that woman looked at you, and how many times I went home and didn't say anything. A pause. This morning I decided I was done with that particular kind of going home. Renee was quiet. It won't always go the way it went today, Eleanor continued. Usually there's no business card. Usually the person standing there is just a person standing there. Renee said, that's the harder version. Much harder. Eleanor nodded, looked at the necklace one more time. Glad I was here today, she said. I'm glad I saw it. She adjusted the strap of her handbag. I'm glad you built this place. Renee looked at her. I built it because of days like the one in Atlanta, she said. The day I decided that the room needed to exist. And now it does. Now it does. Eleanor Voss, 71 years old, 31 years of teaching. A lifetime of learning when to speak and spending much of it staying quiet. She stood a little straighter. Keep building, she said. She walked toward the door, stopped once without turning back. Tell that young woman, Sora. She's going to be good. I already told her, Renee said. Good. She pushed through the door. Tell her again. And she was gone. The door closed behind her. Renee stood in the store she had built and felt the specific quietness of a room after significant has moved through it. Emptiness, something fuller than emptiness, the residue of a morning that had started before dawn and had just only now arrived at something that felt like its actual shape. She found the small desk near the back of the store. It had always been there, from the construction phase when the space was still empty and smelled like new drywall and possibility. From the setup week when she and 2 assistants had spent 4 days placing every display case by hand because she didn't trust anyone else to get the angles right. From every unannounced visit over 8 years, there were always notes to make, calls to return, the quiet administrative work of running something large that continued, regardless of where you happened to be standing. She sat in the chair. The familiar resistance of it, this particular chair had been here since the beginning, a plain wooden thing she had brought from her office because she liked having something consistent in the spaces that changed around her. She looked the store through the gap between the display cases. Damien was with the woman by the engagement rings. The conversation had shifted. She could tell from 15 feet away, from posture alone, the way both of them had leaned slightly forward, the woman's hands uncrossed and open now, gesturing as she described something. The defensive body language of someone caught in an unexpected situation had given way to the open body language of someone remembering why they had come. Damien was listening with his full attention, not performing attention, actually there. He was going to be good at this. She had known it from the moment she saw him put the clipboard down. Near the jewelry counter, Sora was completing Eleanor's transaction. She moved through it with the care of someone who understood that the object in her hands was not just an object, that the bracelet in the velvet box represents the savitsi that would sit on a 16-year-old's wrist at her birthday dinner and at her first job interview, and at whatever came after that for the next 40 years if she took care of it. Sora understood that. You could see it in her hands, the way she checked the clasp twice without being asked. Roy was moving through the room the way he always moved, present without being obtrusive, watching without performing watchfulness. The morning had cost him something, not the job as it turned out, but the particular version of Tuesday he had imagined when he set his alarm, the ordinary shift, the uneventful 8 hours, the spot drive home in the afternoon without having had to make a decision that would take weeks to stop thinking about. Version of Tuesday was gone. What was here instead was harder in some ways, but not worse. Renee picked up her phone. Sarah answered before the second ring. That was one of the things about Sarah. She had worked for Renee for 11 years and had developed, over that time, the specific professional instincts of someone who understood that when Renee called from a store during an unannounced visit, the call was not routine. Board is assembled, Sarah said. 11 of 12. Marcus is traveling, but he's on from Singapore. Good enough. Renee looked at the store through the display case gap. Damien had moved to stand beside the engagement ring case, opening the top drawer to retrieve something the woman had pointed to. I want to go through the events of this morning. All of it. I want it formally documented with a timestamp and a full record of what occurred, what was said, and by whom. Of course. And I want to talk about training. She paused. Chose her next words carefully, because the way you framed something at the board level determined how it got implemented 6 layers down. Company-wide, I don't want this framed as a reactive measure. I don't want the language to suggest that today's incident is the reason we're doing this. I want it framed as a proactive investment, which have been before today. Understood. Every store manager and assistant manager. Person, not a webinar, not a packet sent to regional offices and assumed to have been read. In person in rooms together, actually talking. Paused. Within 30 days, a silence from Sarah that communicated the logistics of what she was describing without requiring her to say them out loud. All 47 locations, Ray said, before Sarah. That's significant. I know what it costs, not sharply. The simple fact of having already done the calculation and accept the number. Do it. Yes. The format I want is not lecture-based. I don't want a consultant standing at the front of a room for 6 hours reading slides about unconscious bias. I want actual conversation. I want managers in rooms together asking each other hard questions about what this company requires of them and what it means, specifically with examples, not in the abstract, to fail at that requirement. She paused, and I want the curriculum designed by people who have lived this, not by a firm that's never worked retail a day in their professional lives. I'll reach out to the DEI office and see who they recommend. Reach out to Eleanor Voss. A pause. She's a customer, Sarah said. Careful, not pushing back, just identifying the fact that needed to be addressed. She's a retired educator with 31 years of classroom experience who watched exactly what this training needs to address play out in front of her this morning. In real time. Professional distance. Renee paused. She spoke. She said in 2 sentences, most training programs spend 6 hours trying to communicate and never quite reach. Or pause. Ask her if she'd be willing to consult on the curriculum design. Tell her I asked personally. Tell her she can say no. I'll reach out today. Good. One more thing. Renee looked across the room at Roy, who was standing near the entrance with the particular stillness of someone who had not fully processed yet that the morning was over and he still had a job. Roy Tanner, security, Beverly Hills location. His raise is effective today. Don't wait for the next payroll site. Cut a check this week. Paused, and the commendation goes in his permanent file with a personal note from me, not from HR. From corporate communications, from right today. Done, Sarah said. Anything else? Renee looked at the store. Damien, who was now showing the woman by the engagement rings 2 different settings for the same stone, explaining the difference with the patience of someone in suit that this was not a sales conversation. It was a conversation about one of the most significant purchases this woman's family would make this year, and it deserved to be treated accordingly. At Sora, who had finished Eleanor's transaction and was now walking a different customer, a young man, nervous, clearly here for the first time, through the pendant display with the ease of someone who had just been reminded in the most direct possible way of why the job mattered. Roy, who had turned slightly toward the window and was looking out at Rodeo Drive with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance, but recognized as the expression of someone who had made a decision they were at peace with, even if peace and ease were not the same thing and never had been. It's everything for now, she said. I'll have a written report to you by end of day. She ended the call. Set the phone on the desk, sat for a moment in the particular quiet of someone who has been moving through something difficult for several hours and has arrived, finally, at a point where the moving is temporarily complete. 47 stores, 12 states, $180 million a year. She had built all of it, from the girl on the side street in Atlanta who stood outside a door with a helpful wanted sign in the window and made a promise in the space of 45 seconds. Talks from that sidewalk and from the years after it, the 14-hour days and the early rejections and the suppliers who had underquoted her, assuming she checked the math and the investors and proved his word herself 3 times over what they required from other founders in the room she had walked into where someone looked at her and made a decision before she had opened her mouth. From all of that, and from the determination, which had never wavered even in the years when it probably should have, to turn all of that into something that meant the opposite. A room where everyone who walked through the door was wanted. Everyone. She opened her notebook. Actual paper one. She had been using the same kind since her 20s. A plain composition notebook that cheap and reliable. Kind that didn't require a charger and didn't crash and didn't ask her to update its software when she was trying to think. She wrote 4 names: Damian Cruz, Sora Nakamura, Roy Tanner, Eleanor Voss. She looked at them for a moment. These 4 people who had each made a decision this morning that cost them something. Damian, who had put down his clipboard and refused a bad order from someone who had the authority to fire him. Sora, who had turned away from a door and come back and stood in a shadow with her phone recording that needed to be recorded. Roy, who had stayed exactly where he was when staying was the most expensive thing he could have done. Eleanor, who had stood up for a stranger in a room where it would have been so much easier, so much more comfortable, to stay in her chair and mind her own business. None of them had done anything dramatic. None of them had given a speech or made a grand gesture or acted in a way that would look heroic in retrospect. Each just a small decision in the moment it was required to do the right thing rather than the convenient thing. Those small-to-small scissions stacked on top of each other in the space of 45 minutes had changed the shape of what the morning became. She wrote 2 words beneath the 4 names. "This is why." Then she closed the notebook, because that was enough. Was the whole of what needed to be written there. The rest of it, the 23 years, the promise on the slot box, the floor of the empty store with bad coffee and the paper, drafts, all of it lived in those 4 names and those 2 words and didn't need anything added to it. She put the notebook in her bag and went back out to the floor. The mail arrived at her office at 9 in the morning, the way it always did. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building in Century City, glass on 2 sides, the city visible on clear days all the way to the hills. She had chosen this office not for the view, though the view was something, but because the building had been built in 1971 and had the particular solidity of structures from that era, the sense that the walls were doing actual structural work and not just suggesting it. She liked working in rooms that held their weight. Stack came in with her second coffee. Reports, correspondence, 2 samples from the design team that needed her sign-off before the New York collection went to production. A magazine that had run a profile she had been told was coming out this month and would need to read before the calls started coming in. She moved through it methodically, the way she moved through all of it, giving each thing the attention it required and no more. She was halfway through the Aurora proposal for the New York location, the stone sourcing for the secondary pieces, which was going to require a conversation with the supplier in Antwerp that she had been putting off because the supplier in Antwerp had a habit of treating every negotiation as a performance of his own expertise rather than a business conversation, which she found exhausting when Sarah set the day's mail on the corner of her desk and left without being asked to. 11 years, Sarah understood when to come and go. She almost didn't notice the envelope. It was in the middle of the stack. No company letterhead, no return address. A standard white envelope, the kind bought in bulk at any office supply store, slightly smaller than the others around it. Her name on the front in handwriting that was careful in the specific way that handwriting is careful when the person doing it is concentrating harder than usual. The concentration of someone unaccustomed to writing. The concentration of someone trying to say something they haven't said before and wanting the physical act of saying it to be right. She set the Antwerp notes aside, picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, then opened it. 1 page. Handwritten on both sides, the same careful hand throughout, consistent pressure, no crossed-out words, which told her that whoever had written this had drafted it somewhere else first and copied it out clean. Of someone who had revised what they wanted to say until they were certain of it before they committed it to the page they would actually send. Sylvia didn't open with an apology. She opened with a statement of fact. She had been seeing a therapist. Started 9 days after the Beverly Hills morning, not the following week, but 9 days after, because the first week she told herself she didn't need it. And then she had spent 3 nights in a row not sleeping and had made the call on the 4th morning before she could talk herself out of it again. Because anyone required it. No court, no company, no legal proceeding had made it a condition of anything. Separation from Luminous Designs had been clean and final and came with no attached requirements, which Sylvia wrote that she had been surprised by, then had understood, was itself a statement, that Renee was not interested in rehabilitation as a performance, was not interested in mandated contrition, was not interested in the version of accountability that existed primarily to satisfy observers. She had started therapy because she could not sleep. More precisely, she could sleep. She fell asleep without difficulty. It was the staying asleep that had failed. She would wake at 2 in the morning or 3 or some formless hour before dawn that she had never previously been awake to experience, and she would find her mind already running, not racing, not the anxious cycling of someone catastrophizing about consequences. Just running, turning over a specific sequence of events with the methodical persistence of something trying to understand itself. Not the moment with the business card. The moment she sat in the chair and the full weight of what she had done arrived. Not the moment of walking out with the cardboard box, which had been bad but had been, in its way, clarifying. A defined event with a defined end. The moment she kept returning to was earlier than any of that. The 15 minutes. She wrote about the 15 minutes in detail. The champagne she had carried to the other side of the room, the conversation she had with the Harringtons while someone stood alone at an open display case behind her. She had not looked at the woman once during those 15 minutes, she wrote. She had been aware, at some peripheral level, that the woman was still there. And she had registered it the way you register a sound in another room. Present, noted, not acted on. She had thought at the time that she was being professional, making a judgment call, protecting the store's interests as she understood them, which she now understood she had understood incorrectly in ways she was still in the process of mapping. But in the therapist office, describing it, the 15 minutes, the champagne, the deliberate not looking, she had heard herself say it out loud for the first time. Texiix, it's of saying it out loud, of listening to her own account of her own behavior in a room with another person, had been different from the experience of carrying it internally. She wrote, "It didn't sound like what I thought I was doing. It sounded like something else, and I don't fully have the language for what that something else is. My therapist says that finding the language is part of the work, that I am at the beginning of the work and not the middle of it and not anywhere near the end of it, and that understanding where you actually are rather than where you'd like to be, is the first thing." She wrote that she had thought about the girl in Atlanta. She had not known about Atlanta when she walked into work on that Tuesday morning, had known nothing about who she was managing the store on behalf of, had known the name on the memos and the paychecks and the handbook, but had never made that name into a person, had never asked, had never looked beyond the abstraction of corporate, which was its own kind of choice. She was beginning to understand that, the choice to not find out, to not look, to operate inside assumptions she had never examined because the assumptions had never been costly to her. I was taught a set of rules about how the world works. I followed those rules. I believed I was following them correctly. I am trying to understand what it means that following them correctly led me to that morning. My therapist says this is the right question. She says a lot of people that get to the right question. I am not sure if that is comforting or not. She wrote about the Harringtons. That had stayed with her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not the moment with the business card, not the moment with the Forbes profile on Damien's phone. Those moments had been about the fact of who Renee was. The Harringtons had walked back in and set the jewelry box on the counter and said, "We came here because of what this store was supposed to stand for." Had been about something else. That had been about the things she had believed she was protecting and had, in fact, undermined. The people she had thought were on her side of the line she was withdrawing had come back to tell her they hadn't asked to be placed there. She wasn't sure she had understood that when it happened. She was beginning to understand it now. The last act section of the letter was the shortest. She wrote that she wasn't asking for anything. She wanted to be clear about that. She was not writing to request reconsideration or reinstatement or a reference beyond what had already been agreed to. She was not writing because she expected a response or because she needed one. She was writing because she had spent several weeks in a therapist's office being asked to sit with the question of what she owed to the people she had harmed, and she had come to the conclusion that what she owed, not as performance, not as a transaction, but as an honest accounting, was the information that she was trying, that she had succeeded, not that she had arrived anywhere, just that she was trying, and she thought Renee deserved to know that. "I thought you deserved to know that. I'm not asking for anything." Renee read the letter twice. The first time straight through, quickly, the way she read anything unfamiliar, for shape and intent before detail. And time, slowly. Sentence by sentence, the way you read something when you want to be sure you are understanding what is actually being said, rather than what you expect to be said. She set it on the desk in front of her when she was done, and she sat with it. She thought about the woman who had written it. 38 years old, Greenwich, Connecticut. 3 generations of a particular kind of certainty, handed down without anyone calling it certainty, with anyone saying, "Here is the worldview you will inherit. Here are the assumptions that will feel like facts. Here are the rules you will follow without knowing they are rules, because rules only become visible when they stop working in your favor." Sylvia had followed those rules her entire life, without the rules ever failing her, until that Tuesday morning. And the question of what a person did with the first real failure of the system they had been given, whether they defended the system or began, slowly and painfully, to examine it, was not a question with a guaranteed answer. Most people defended. It was easier. The system had served them. The failure felt like an anomaly, not an indictment. Sylvia was not defending. She was in a therapist's office 9 days after the worst morning of her professional life, asking why. It was not nothing. Renee stood up from her desk, walked to the bookshelf along the wall, the one that held things she needed to keep, things that told her something true about where she had been and what it had cost to get to where she was. The photograph from the store's opening day, 23 years ago, her face younger and exhausted and lit from somewhere inside with the specific expression of someone who has just done something they were not certain they could do. The first check she had ever written on a Luminous Designs account, a modest amount for display case hardware, the first purchase made in the company's name rather than her own. A small piece of concrete from the Beverly Hills construction site, rough-edged, unremarkable, kept because she had been standing in the empty space on the day they poured the floor and had picked it up without knowing why and had never been able to throw it away. Draft sketch of the Aurora necklace, paper, P, slightly yellowed at the edges now, the pencil line still clear, the early version, before she had understood what the setting needed to do, before she had started over and found the solution. Kept the wrong version, not the right one, because the wrong version was where the thinking had actually happened. She set the letter on the shelf, next to the sketch, next to the photograph, next to the things she kept because they told her something true. She stood there for a moment looking at the shelf. She didn't respond to the letter, not that day. She sat with the question of whether she would for a long time afterward, on the drive home, in the particular quiet of her kitchen before the morning's second coffee, in the moments between meetings when her mind went somewhere it hadn't been directed. She turned the question over the way you turn over a problem that doesn't have a clean solution, looking at it from different angles to see if any of the angles revealed something the others hadn't. What would a response do? What would it give Sylvia that the letter itself hadn't already given her? What would it give Renee? Whether the distance between them, not the distance of dislike, not the distance of harm, but the distance of two people who had been in a room together on one significant morning and had come away from it changed in different ways. Whether that distance was something correspondence could close, or whether it was the kind of distance that only time worked on, and only partially, and only if both people continued moving in directions that made the closing possible. She didn't know. She kept the letter because she believed in the possibility. After 23 years of walking through doors where she wasn't expected, of staying in rooms where she wasn't wanted, building something from a promise made on a sidewalk in Atlanta, building it carefully, intentionally, with the specific ambition of creating spaces where people were seen rather than sorted away. After all of it, she still believed that people could look at the rules they had been given and choose, deliberately and without any guarantee of succeeding, to question them. It didn't always happen. It was not happening in nearly enough places or with nearly enough frequency, but it happened. She had watched it happen in a store on Rodeo Drive on an ordinary Tuesday morning that had started before dawn. She had watched a young man put down a clipboard and refuse a bad order. Watched a young woman not walk through a door and turn back and stand her ground in a way that asked nothing of anyone except that the truth be documented. Watched a man who needed his job stay exactly where he was when staying was the most expensive choice available to him. Watched a woman of 71 stand up for a stranger because she was tired, finally, of carrying the time she hadn't. None of it had been dramatic. None of it had looked the way justice looked in the stories that got told about justice. It had been quiet, ordinary, four people making small decisions in a short window of time, and those no small decisions had held something together that could very easily have fallen apart. Was what she had built this company for. Not the revenue, not the Forbes rankings, not the 40 stores in 12 states, or the red carpet appearances, or the engagement rings that ended up in photographs, that ended up in magazines. She had built it so that rooms like the one on Rodeo Drive could exist, so that people could walk through a door and be seen. The experience of being in a Luminous Design store was, for every person who walked in, the opposite of what she had felt walking out of a store in Atlanta at 19 with her hand on a door and a help wanted sign behind. The bracelet on her wrist was warm. She touched it once. Then she went back to her desk, picked up the Antwerp notes. Back to work, because the rooms still needed to be built, all of them. That was the promise, and she kept her promises.